This Friday marks 2 years since we said that the global spread of COVID-19 could be characterized as a pandemic. As a reminder, we made that assessment 6 weeks after we declared COVID-19 a global health emergency, when there were fewer than 100 cases and no deaths outside China. 2 years later, more than 6 million people have died. Although reported cases and deaths are declining globally, and several countries have lifted restrictions, the pandemic is far from over, and it will not be over anywhere until it's over everywhere.
Salams from the People's Dispatch studios in New Delhi. You're watching Daily Debrief. That was Dr. Tedros, of course, the boss of the World Health Organization, telling us in no uncertain terms where we stand with regard to the COVID-19 pandemic 2 years on. For more details on the subject and a public health perspective, I spoke earlier to Anna Vrachar.
So, as you mentioned, it's been 2 years since the World Health Organization declared COVID-19 a pandemic. And basically, since 2020, we haven't seen much good stuff happening in this regard, I'm afraid. So first of all, of course, we have had approximately 20 million deaths caused by COVID-19, and these have all been avoidable deaths. So it's depended a lot on how the global north reacted towards the pandemic and how much they differed in their practical response compared to what they promised at the beginning of the pandemic. So if we focus only on the vaccines, which have been a big topic for at least a year and a half, we have seen that while European leaders and North American leaders have been calling for global solidarity and declaring the vaccines as a global public good, we have seen them take very little action on making those vaccines available in other places and in other regions of the world. And this has been quite dramatic, actually, because we witnessed a whole continent, so the whole African continent, which could not reach even 10% of people vaccinated when places in Europe and places in America were well over 70% of vaccinated populations.
Yeah.
But then, of course, there's another set of examples which are much better and much more inspiring. If we look at Cuba, for example, Cuba has been able to do amazing things during the pandemic. It has developed its own vaccines. And more importantly, even, it has made a lot of things happen in order to make the Cuban vaccines available in other countries, especially countries which have been ignored by the global north and been kind of left aside for the past 2 years. And then, of course, at this moment in time, we have seen that, again, rich countries have somehow decided that the pandemic for them is over. We have seen in only a matter of weeks, governments in the UK, in Australia, lifting up public health measures that have been in place for a long time now. And unfortunately, we cannot actually see the conversation continuing. So if the UK, if Australia have decided that somehow the pandemic is over, the pandemic is definitely not over in the rest of the world because the vaccines are still unavailable. There are serious concerns about testing and diagnostics and medicines being available once their production is scaled up. So the important thing is that while the attention of the global community has shifted somewhat to other topics for the past few weeks, it's still important to keep in mind that the pandemic is still here, that we might still face other variants like coming into place in different parts of the world, and that it's still crucial to work on making everything related to COVID-19 accessible everywhere in the world.
Right. So, Anna, you mentioned the 20 million deaths, and the people. This is a number that has been put out there by the People's Vaccine Alliance, sort of countering, in a sense, what the WHO is saying is 6 million deaths. In fact, or assuming that actually the pandemic has had a far greater impact on lives than perhaps even the WHO is measuring at this point. There's also a letter that's going out today addressing, I'm assuming, the question of vaccine inequity globally.
Yes, that's right. So it's a letter that's been published by the People's Vaccine Alliance, and it has been signed by approximately 30 former heads of states and high-level politicians from around the world. These include both former UN General Secretary Ban Ki-moon, but also the current and the former UN Special Rapporteurs on extreme poverty and human rights, as well as a number of other people from the public health and global health arenas. And you're quite right to say that, yes, they definitely address the disparities in access to vaccines across the world. But I think that also the letter is important because it takes a much broader stance. So in addition to the deaths that have been caused by COVID-19 since 2020, the pandemic has had a huge impact on people's lives in different ways. So we're talking about loss of employment, about children not being able to attend school, about the rise in gender-based violence at home. So these are all things that we're still going to face once the pandemic is over. And I'm not sure that we're still able to comprehend the extent to which these things go. And the letter does a very good job at shining a light on that. It's also quite important because it brings into discussion several points which have been left aside, let's say, in on high-level discussions until now. So we're talking about, yes, the importance of passing a TRIPS waiver, a waiver of intellectual property rights at the WTO, which would allow us to increase production of vaccines, but also of tests, of drugs, making sure that all production capacities all over the world are used in order to make COVID-19 medical products accessible to all, free of charge at any point in time when they need it. But it also stresses the importance of strengthening public health systems. And this is quite important because we have seen that even once the rich countries decided that they have had enough of vaccine doses and that they were finally ready to donate them to the rest of the world, we have seen very serious issues arising because the health systems were not prepared to administer such large quantities of vaccines in a very short time. And this has been a very, very serious issue because most of those vaccines were quite near, yes, they were quite near the expiry date. And this, of course, is a completely different issue because, of course, we have to answer a question: why were they saved for so long, and why weren't they distributed before? But the important part is that we recognize that for pandemic responses in this moment, but also in the future, we really need public health systems which are capable of carrying out that response. And it means that we have to have enough health workers who are trained, who are there in large numbers, adequately paid, and have adequate access to protective equipment that they may need. So these are all issues that the letter does bring out, and that it insists that the world has to address in the months to come.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think something that the Global South as a whole will resonate with for sure, because we've seen the impact that the pandemic has had, and it's exposed all of these fault lines in our public health systems. Thank you very much for joining us on Daily Debrief today, Anna, and I hope to see you again soon. Next up, in Australia, a jury has acquitted police officer Zachary Rolfe, who was accused of killing an Indigenous teenager. He's been deemed not guilty of murder by a 12-member jury and was also cleared of 2 other charges of manslaughter and engaging in a violent act causing death. Rolfe was facing these charges after the killing of 19-year-old Kumanjai Walker during a violent arrest attempt in 2019. The trial was also the first of its kind since the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Deaths in Custody released its report back in 1991. For more on the story now, Anish joins us. Anish, tell us first a little bit more about the case itself.
Yeah, so one of the things that the prosecution kind of expanded on was the very problematic circumstances of the arrest. We had the police knowing that there will be a violent altercation, between them and Walker. They went with the whole barging into his house, trying to apprehend him physically and pin him down, and so on and so forth. And they were completely armed, all of them. And so the altercation happened, and Walker had apparently stabbed Rolf during this apprehension attempt. And after the stabbing, the first shot was fired. After the first shot, three other fellow officers that that were part of the arrest team had incapacitated him with a bed mattress. And in that, he was not in a position to actually be harmful.
Right.
It was pretty much done for. But even then, 2 more shots were fired, and then he was found to be dead. So this is where we have to understand, there was a premeditated attack in the name of arrest that happened. And this happened in a remote community. A remote community in Australia is basically mostly indigenous communities in the outback and the rural regions of Australia. And so in general, these communities are over-policed, but they completely are devoid of any kind of developmental or progress or infrastructural progress even that happens in their region. So this sort of arrest first and then you talk later is sort of one of the most common things that police does.
Right.
And at the
MO.
Exactly. So in this case, there was also safer plans to apprehend him, even if the arrest could be considered necessary.
Right.
The police did not go for that. In fact, Rolf actually struck that down. So this was a sort of like a prepared plan to actually premeditated in many ways to actually go for something that would be that could cause problems. So this is the context of this mindset of Rolf was brought out, but even then the jury refused to find him guilty.
Right.
And even the fact that the 2 other shots that later happened were also found deemed unnecessary because there were obviously body cam footage and everything that was seen. And even then there was this verdict that comes in, and that is also primarily because there was not a single person who was indigenous in the 12-member jury.
Right.
And this is in a state where 30% of the population identify as Aboriginal or indigenous persons. So you can't find a single person to serve in the jury where an indigenous person was killed or somebody from the community, which is mostly indigenous. Says a lot about how the jury selection happened, how the case was already prejudiced against any kind of conviction for Rolf. Even the fact that Rolf was given a bail just hours after his arrest in 2019 in a murder charge, in a premeditated murder charge, that is not the norm in anywhere in Australia. So this shows that there was a certain kind of institutional bias that helped Rolf. And considering the fact that this is the first case, as you pointed out, since 1991, first trial to ever reach the courts, an outcome of this sort is definitely going to be disheartening and disappointing for the Aboriginal community at large.
Yeah, sending out a clear message, I think,
Exactly.
on those lines, both the judicial lines as well as the policing lines, and what the institutions consider or their relationship with the indigenous communities. Thanks for that update, Anish. Our final story on this Friday episode of Daily Debrief is from the world of football. We're talking specifically about big sport and how it becomes even a front sometimes for war. The specific case, of course, is the seizure or the decision by UK Parliament to seize control of Chelsea Football Club because it is owned by Russian billionaire Roman Abramovich. For more on the story, I spoke earlier to NewsClick's sports editor, Leslie Xavier. For the third time, Leslie, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think Chelsea are currently both champions of Europe as well as the world, club champions that is. But things not going too well for the football club. A time of, I guess, chaos, and of course we are justifying having this conversation by the fact that, perhaps we do have space in the world to be worried about not just one thing at a time. What is the latest with Chelsea Football Club, and what is likely to happen? Is this an end to a period of unprecedented success?
I mean, yeah, that's the firstly to link the club's fortunes with the money and the ownership and the money being pumped in. That's actually a sad state in football, right? But that's the reality of the economics of the game that is prevalent at this point in history. Getting back to Chelsea, Roman Abramovich is facing a lot of heat over there in the UK, and the latest is yesterday the UK Parliament made this decision, and I believe it would be an unprecedented decision that way, to freeze all his assets and impose a sanction on him. So that in effect means that he can't go ahead with the sale that he was proposing over the past 2 weeks. So basically, it started off with the Russia-Ukraine war and a lot of criticism on the ownership of Chelsea because Abramovich is considered very close to Putin. Vladimir Putin has a lot of interest, business interest as well as political interest in Russia. And then he tried to
oligarchs of the world unite and all that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And in that he tried to distance himself from the club by saying that the reins of the club would be handed over to the board. But then that wasn't enough, and he then announced that he is putting up the club for sale, but for an amount that is probably not feasible, not practical also for the buyers. So maybe some negotiations would have happened. I think Abramovich is, firstly, he doesn't want to sell, or maybe he wants to make a quick buck because it's the right. We had this discussion in the same show a couple of days back. And right now, so with the frozen assets, you can't go ahead with that sale. While there are commentators who are talking about how the UK government can step in and save the club. Save the club, that is the point. Save the club by ensuring that the sale goes on, but the proceeds won't go to Abramovich. So it's basically robbery. It's like what happens in olden days when a visiting army sieges a fortress and then they take everything that is there inside.
Yeah,
right? Something.
I mean, not just in old times. A few weeks ago, Joe Biden has frozen $7 billion in Afghanistan's national assets. Da Bank of Afghanistan has $7 billion US dollars have been frozen, and half of that has been reallocated to families of 9/11 victims seeking legal damages in the United States. So these are not far-fetched scenarios at all.
So that's the whole point, that one is left wondering whether we talk about a world which is free and open to trade and enterprise, and which is the hallmark of the modern version of postmodern version of capitalism that way. And then these things happen where it goes back to the olden ways where politics come in and then full-fledged attack. So one is taken back to US during the Cold War, when there is this thing called McCarthyism, right? Senator Joseph McCarthy, who went on a witch hunt against all the communists across the country. And this is something like a blanket attack. And in fact, again, online, I mean, I've read a few pieces where political commentators have spoken and compared and termed this as neo-McCarthyism. Basically, the targeting of the Russians across a blanket target. We are talking about sportspersons, we are talking about businessmen, we are talking about artists. So, so what does it entail? What does this portray our world to be at this juncture? That is also a larger question that we need to ask. Of course, a war is raging, a dangerous game is being played, but at the same time, it is also pulling humanity, human enterprise, what we have built so far as a modern society back towards whatever the age that is dark, semi-dark, gray. I don't know.
I do have a second question for you, Leslie, which is essentially that if now we want to play the card of free and fair, then we must also impose similar kind of sanctions on US-owned football clubs in the United Kingdom. Limited not only to two that come to mind. One is, of course, Arsenal, and the other being perhaps Manchester United as well, is US-owned. But jokes apart, I mean, like maybe going to a time when, or going to a scenario when You have the North London derby being played not between Chelsea and Arsenal, but between, I don't know, taxpayers football club and the United Kingdom government. Maybe that's a scenario that we're looking at.
So that's the larger thing. It's not just about business then. Na? When we look at being fair, then the world body, FIFA, should be fair into assessing the fact that there is political influence in the running of the game in a particular country. And that is actually a big sin in the world of sport. I mean, so-called. IOC generally steps in when such things happen, when national federations are running of a sport in a country is interfered. FIFA steps in. And then there you go. FA is party to. I'm not saying FA is the decision maker here. UK Parliament is, but FA is party to, and also succumbing to that influence for whatever the constraints that they have to follow. And so then FIFA maybe should ban English FA. I mean, to be fair, but it's not exactly fair that way, right? The business of sport, and I call it the business of sport because increasingly that's where. That's what it's coming out as. Whatever the larger message of sporting bodies giving out through sanctions, through bans, ultimately it boils down to the business.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think football is very much at the center of that global conversation of big sport and big capital and entertainment industry and all of those things. Thanks very much, Leslie, for your time today. We'll catch you again on the show sometime next week. That's all we have on this episode of Daily Debrief. For more details on all of these stories, you can visit our website, peoplesdispatch.org. And also do give us a follow on all the regular social media platforms for updates. We'll be back same time, same place tomorrow. See you then. Goodbye.